The town had seen many weddings before, but none quite like this. On that quiet evening in the Old West, when a blind pianist stood before the altar to wed the sheriff's daughter, the air itself seemed to tremble with unspoken anticipation. The keys of his piano had long carried whispers of sorrow and hope through dusty saloons, and now those same hands were bound in matrimony to the woman everyone believed to be untouchable. The crowd held its breath, as if they knew that behind the lace and vows, something extraordinary was waiting to surface. The sheriff's daughter was admired for her grace, yet feared for her silence. Few dared to imagine what secrets she might carry, and fewer still believed anyone could unlock them. But there she stood, smiling as if her life were about to begin, while her eyes carried a shadow that no one could name. Her choice of husband had already shaken the town. Why him? The man who played music in darkness, instead of the many suitors who promised power and fortune? Every detail of that night seemed painted in mystery. The candles burned lower, the whispers grew louder, and the tension inside the room pressed against every heart. The pianist, though blind, felt it in the air, sensed it in her trembling hands, and knew their story had only just begun. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the celebration roared. But beneath the laughter, an unexplainable weight lingered, as though fate itself had chosen this moment to reveal its hand. When the newlyweds retreated into the silence of their wedding night, the sheriff's daughter carried with her more than the veil of a bride. She carried a truth that had lived in shadows for too long, a secret that would not only define her marriage, but alter the destiny of the entire town. As the door closed behind them, she turned to her husband, her voice steady yet fragile, and prepared to uncover what no one else dared to know. And it was in that moment, the moment between love and revelation, that the true story began. A tale where loyalty would be tested, where music would become a weapon, and where the past would collide with the present in ways no soul could predict. What she whispered that night was more than a confession. It was the spark that would ignite a fire across the plains, forever changing the lives of those who thought they knew her. The blind pianist sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet rustle of her dress as she moved across the room. He had learned to live in a world painted not with colors but with sounds, and tonight every breath, every hesitant step of his bride, struck him deeper than the notes of any melody he had ever played. She lingered in silence, as if carrying a weight she had long feared to release. The walls of the small room seemed to press inward, urging the truth to be spoken. Finally, her voice broke through the stillness, soft yet sharp, trembling with something between fear and resolve. "I must tell you," she whispered, "before this night continues, you need to know who I truly am." The pianist's hands clenched against the blanket, not in anger but in readiness. He had learned that in the West, survival often depended on the strength to hear truths that shattered illusions. And now, he braced for one that could alter not just their marriage, but everything he thought he knew about her. She confessed that she was not simply the sheriff's daughter. She was the secret keeper of a past drenched in blood and betrayal. Years ago, when outlaws set fire to their town, it had not been her father alone who stood against them. She had carried a pistol hidden beneath her skirts, firing into the darkness, protecting lives while the world thought she was tucked away safely. The town never knew her hand had spilled blood that night. To them, she remained pure, fragile, untouchable. But she had lived with the memory every single day. The pianist's heart pounded as he listened. He had dreamed of marrying a woman of light, a symbol of hope in a lawless land. Instead, he found himself bound to someone who carried the shadow of violence deep within her soul. And yet, he did not recoil. To a man who lived without sight, truth was not found in appearances, but in the weight of a person's spirit. And in her trembling confession, he recognized not shame, but courage. As the night grew heavier, he reached for her hand, tracing the trembling fingers that had once pulled a trigger. "Secrets don't break a marriage," he said quietly. "Silence does." In that moment, a bond was forged between them, not of perfect innocence, but of shared humanity. Yet neither of them knew that outside their window, the West was stirring again, and the shadows of her secret were already riding closer. Morning came with the sound of horses in the distance, their hooves echoing against the hard earth like an omen. The pianist, though blind, could sense the shift in the air, the sudden tension, the hushed voices from the street below. His bride leaned against the window, her face pale as she saw a group of riders approaching. These were not townsfolk, but strangers wrapped in dust and menace, men whose presence carried the weight of unfinished business. The sheriff, her father, stepped out onto the porch, hand resting on his revolver. The townspeople gathered, whispering nervously, for they remembered the night of fire and gunshots long ago. They remembered the outlaws who vanished into the dark, vowing to return. And now, years later, those riders had come back, demanding a debt that had never been repaid. But the sheriff's daughter knew the truth. The debt was not her father's alone. It was hers. Inside the room, she turned to her husband, her voice unsteady. "They're not here for him. They're here for me." The pianist tilted his head, his expression calm, yet unreadable. "Then you are not facing this alone," he replied. He had no sight, no weapon, but he carried something more powerful, a soul trained to endure hardship, and a heart that refused to let fear dictate his steps. The riders dismounted, their boots thudding against the wooden boards as they demanded justice. The sheriff denied their claims, swearing he had killed their leader years ago. But one of the men laughed bitterly, pointing a scarred finger toward the sheriff's daughter. "It wasn't you," he sneered. "It was her." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and in that single moment, her carefully protected secret burned in the open daylight. Whispers turned to judgment, and judgment turned to fear. The pianist felt her hand slip from his, as though she were sinking into the weight of her own shame. Yet he refused to let go. "The West is full of broken men," he said firmly, raising his voice for all to hear. "But a broken soul that still dares to love, still dares to fight for life, is worth more than every outlaw breathing." His words silenced the crowd, but the riders only tightened their grips on their guns. The storm was far from over, and the desert winds promised that blood would soon be spilled again. The tension in the street felt like a noose tightening around every throat. Dust swirled lazily in the morning sun, but beneath that quiet veil, violence was ready to ignite. The sheriff's daughter stood frozen on the steps, her secret laid bare before the entire town. She had always known this day would come, but not like this. Not with her husband at her side, a man who could not see the danger, but could feel every heartbeat trembling in the air. The outlaw leader, a tall man with a scar cutting across his jaw, stepped forward with a mocking smile. The blind man thinks he can speak of courage. He jeered, his voice sharp enough to draw nervous laughter from his gang. But courage won't save her. Blood for blood, that's the law we live by. His hand hovered near his revolver, and the crowd shrank back, terrified of the violence about to erupt. The sheriff tried to intervene, shouting that the town would not be bullied, but his words carried little weight. Everyone could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just about outlaws and revenge, it was about truth. The sheriff had built his reputation on strength and justice, yet here was the reality. It was his daughter who had pulled the trigger that night long ago, his daughter who had defended the town when no one else could. And now, that truth threatened to destroy them all. The pianist, sensing the silence that followed the outlaw's threat, rose to his feet. His cane tapped against the wooden boards, a sound steady and deliberate. Though blind, he faced the gang as though he could see straight through them. "You think vengeance is justice," he said calmly, "but you've forgotten the cost. A life taken in anger chains a man forever to the grave he digs." His words carried a weight that unsettled even the hardened outlaws, for they were spoken without fear, as if the desert itself had lent its voice through him. The sheriff's daughter watched him, tears burning in her eyes. She had lived years believing her secret would one day destroy her. Yet now, with her husband standing before armed men, his blindness no weakness but a kind of shield, she realized that love itself could be the weapon they needed most. Still, she also knew that words alone would not turn away the guns. And as the scarred outlaw's hand finally dropped to his revolver, the air cracked with the sound of fate drawing near. The first gunshot split the silence, echoing against the wooden walls like thunder across the desert. Townsfolk scattered, women screamed, and children dove for cover. But when the smoke cleared, it was not blood on the ground. Only the outlaw's hat, knocked from his head by a bullet that had come from nowhere. All eyes turned to the sheriff, his revolver still raised, his hand steady at last. The lawman had chosen his moment, but in his eyes burned not victory, only dread. The scarred outlaw laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "So the sheriff still has fire in him," he growled. "Then let the whole town burn for what you both stole from us." He motioned to his men, and in an instant, the standoff became a storm. Guns were drawn, boots pounded the earth, and the once peaceful street transformed into a battlefield. Yet amid the chaos, the blind pianist stood unshaken, listening, calculating. For a man who lived by sound, every movement was a map, every footstep a warning. The sheriff's daughter ran to her husband's side, gripping his arm tightly. She had seen bloodshed before, but this time it was different. This time, she had something to lose, someone she could not bear to see harmed. "Stay with me," she whispered urgently. "Don't let go." Her voice broke with desperation, yet her hands trembled not with fear, but with resolve. She had once defended her people in the shadows. Now she would defend her husband in the open light of day. The pianist tilted his head, hearing the scuff of boots behind him. With a swift motion, he pulled his bride down, just as a bullet shattered the window above. The town erupted in screams once more, but in that chaos, a strange calm fell over him. He could feel the rhythm of battle, the heartbeat of men who thought themselves untouchable. And though he carried no gun, he carried something else. The unyielding certainty that fate had brought him here not to be a victim, but to be a shield. As dust and smoke filled the street, the sheriff's daughter realized her secret was no longer hers alone. The town had seen her truth, the outlaws had heard it, and her husband had embraced it. Now, she would have to fight not only for her life, but for the bond they had forged in the shadows of confession. And as another gunshot rang out, louder than the rest, she knew their story was only tightening its grip on destiny. The sun hung high, burning against the chaos below, as if the heavens themselves refused to look away. Gunfire rattled through the street, splintering wood and shattering glass, each echo a reminder of how quickly life could be stolen in the Old West. Yet even amid the storm, the blind pianist stood unbroken, his hand locked with hers. He could not see the bullets ripping through the air, but he felt the tremor of her pulse, the urgency in her breath, and that was enough to keep him grounded. The sheriff, crouched behind a wagon, barked orders to the townsfolk, urging them to hold the line. But fear still clouded the people's eyes, and few raised their weapons. The scarred outlaw and his men moved like wolves, circling, snarling, eager to sink their teeth into the weakness they saw before them. Their vengeance was not just for the lives lost years ago, but for the humiliation of knowing a woman had undone their power. And that wound, festering in pride, was far deadlier than any bullet. The sheriff's daughter took a revolver from her father's belt, her hand steady in spite of the trembling world around her. She had promised herself never to kill again, never to relive the night when fire and death swallowed the town. But now she understood. Sometimes the past is not a curse, but a teacher. She took aim, not with rage, but with clarity, firing into the dust where one of the outlaws crouched. The man fell, and the crowd gasped, not in horror, but in awe. The woman they had whispered about, the one they had judged, was now their shield. The pianist listened, every shot marking a pattern, every movement sketching a picture in his mind. He knew where the danger pressed hardest, and with a voice like iron, he shouted directions. "Left side, the barrel. Behind you, the window." His blindness sharpened into something uncanny, as though his music had trained him all his life to sense rhythms beyond what eyes could capture. The townsfolk, startled by his certainty, began to act on his words, firing where he commanded, finding courage where before there had been none. Slowly, the tide began to turn. What had begun as a hopeless standoff became something more, a rebellion of voices, hearts, and hands refusing to bow to fear. And at the center of it all stood a blind man and the sheriff's daughter, their unity binding the broken town together. But just as the outlaws faltered, the scarred leader drew his weapon again, his rage boiling over. His next bullet, he swore, would not miss. The scarred outlaw raised his gun, his eyes fixed on the pianist, the man who dared to command without sight. "If the town wants a savior," he spat, "then let them watch him die." Time slowed in that instant, every sound stretching into silence. The sheriff's daughter saw the glint of steel, felt her breath catch in her throat, and knew she had only one heartbeat to decide between life and loss. She lunged forward, shoving her husband aside, just as the shot rang out. The bullet tore into the wooden beam behind him, splinters exploding like sparks. Gasps erupted from the crowd, but she did not falter. With fire in her eyes, she raised her revolver again and faced the outlaw directly. "You want me?" she shouted, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "Then face the woman who ended your terror once, and who will end it again." The scarred man sneered, circling her like a predator, but something in her defiance unsettled him. He had expected fear, shame, maybe even tears. Instead, he saw a woman forged by fire, unbroken by secrets. The pianist, regaining his footing, turned toward the sound of her voice. "You're not alone," he said firmly, the weight of his words cutting through the tension. Even without eyes, he was a presence that could not be ignored. The townsfolk, inspired by their courage, stepped out from hiding places. One by one, rifles and pistols were raised, no longer trembling. The people who had once judged her now stood ready to fight beside her. For the first time, the outlaw gang realized they were not facing a broken town, but a united one, a town awakened by the truth. The scarred man's grip tightened on his revolver, fury and pride warring inside him. But in that moment, with the sheriff's daughter staring him down and the blind pianist standing tall beside her, he understood that this battle was no longer just about vengeance. It was about who would own the soul of the West, the law of blood or the strength of love. And the desert wind seemed to whisper that only one would walk away. The street fell into a strange stillness, the kind that comes before a storm breaks loose. Dust drifted lazily in the sunlight, yet every soul could feel the sharpness of the moment cutting deeper than any blade. The scarred outlaw stood across from the sheriff's daughter, his revolver glinting with menace, while the blind pianist rested his hand on her arm, as though anchoring her to something greater than fear. No one moved, for they all knew the next shot would decide more than just life or death. It would decide the fate of the entire town. The outlaw spat into the dirt, a bitter smile twisting across his scarred face. "You think your truth makes you strong?" he sneered. "But strength is bought in blood, not in words." His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent his life feeding on terror, convinced that fear itself was a weapon. But the sheriff's daughter, her grip steady on the revolver, did not flinch. "Then you've never known love," she replied, her voice clear, echoing against the saloon walls. "Because love doesn't just survive blood. It redeems it." Her words stirred something in the crowd, a trembling they could not contain. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men exchanged glances heavy with guilt and hope, and even the sheriff lowered his weapon slightly, his eyes locked on his daughter. For years, she had lived beneath his shadow, her secret kept in silence, her strength hidden behind a mask of obedience. But here she was, standing taller than him, facing death without blinking. She was no longer just the sheriff's daughter. She was the West itself, raw and unyielding. The blind pianist tilted his head, listening. He could hear the outlaw's boots grinding against the dirt, the hitch in his breath, the trembling of a hand too used to violence, but now shaking with doubt. And with a calm certainty, he spoke once more. "Your fight is already lost. Because even if you kill us, you will never silence what's been revealed here today." His words struck like an unseen blow, shifting the balance of power in ways no bullet could. The outlaw's sneer faltered, just for a moment. The man who had come to reclaim fear now stood surrounded by something he could not crush: truth, love, and a town reborn from the ashes of its own silence. But pride is a ruthless master, and pride would not let him walk away. With a roar of fury, he raised his revolver once more, determined to drown the desert in blood. The shot rang out, louder than all the rest, tearing through the tense air like lightning across a storm. The townsfolk gasped, hearts stopping as they waited to see who had fallen. For a breathless second, it seemed as though fate itself held its hand over the outcome, stretching time into eternity. Then the truth came crashing down. The scarred outlaw staggered back, his revolver slipping from his hand, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. It was not the sheriff's daughter who had fired. It was the sheriff himself, his face lined with pain, his eyes burning with the weight of a father's choice. For years, he had carried the guilt of letting his daughter carry the burden of that night of fire and blood. But in this moment, he reclaimed his duty, not as the lawman, but as the father who should have borne her secret all along. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the outlaw dropped to his knees, gasping for air, before collapsing into the dust. His men, leaderless and shaken, faltered. Some lowered their guns. Others fled into the open desert, their rage collapsing into fear. The battle that had threatened to consume the town was over in an instant, ended not by vengeance, but by a choice rooted in love and sacrifice. The sheriff stood trembling, his revolver still raised, his eyes wet with tears he had never allowed himself to shed. The sheriff's daughter dropped her weapon, rushing to her father's side. For the first time, she saw not the lawman, not the protector, but the man who had carried his own shame in silence. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking. But he shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I should have saved you long ago." The blind pianist stepped closer, his hand finding hers, grounding her as the weight of years of silence finally broke free. The town exhaled together, like a single body released from chains. The dust began to settle, but the memory of what had unfolded would never leave them. They had seen secrets exposed, courage tested, and redemption claimed in the very heart of blood and fire. Yet even as the outlaw lay lifeless in the dirt, a question lingered in the wind. Had peace truly been won, or had they only opened the door to a new kind of reckoning? The silence that followed was not peace, but the heavy stillness of a town trying to understand what it had just witnessed. Children peeked from behind doorframes. Men lowered their rifles with trembling hands, and women clutched each other as though anchoring themselves to something solid in the aftermath of chaos. The scarred outlaw lay motionless in the dirt, and the desert wind carried away the last breath of his fury. Yet no one could deny that the air still vibrated with tension, as if the earth itself refused to let the story end so easily. The sheriff holstered his revolver with slow, deliberate movements. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of what he had done, and of what he had failed to do for so many years. He looked at his daughter, not as the lawman who had once tried to shield her from the world, but as a father who finally saw her truth. For the first time, words seemed small compared to the bond that had just been reforged in fire. She had carried his shame and his burden for too long, and by pulling the trigger today, he had carried it back onto his own shoulders. The blind pianist stood tall, his hands still clasped around his bride's. Though he could not see the body lying in the street, he could hear the whispers moving through the crowd. Whispers of judgment, of admiration, of confusion. To him, the sound was more powerful than sight. It told him that the town was forever changed, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. He felt her fingers trembling in his palm, not with fear, but with the release of years of silence. As the sheriff's daughter turned toward the people, her heart pounded. She could see the eyes of the town upon her, eyes that had once looked at her with admiration, then suspicion, and now something entirely new: respect. But respect was a double-edged blade. She knew that some would call her a savior, while others would forever remember her as the woman who pulled the trigger twice, years apart, and changed the destiny of the West both times. The outlaw's men were gone, but their threat lingered in the dust. Justice had been served in the eyes of some, but revenge often left shadows long after the gunfire ceased. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, each person carrying their own version of the truth, the sheriff's daughter realized that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life where every choice she made would echo beyond herself, into her marriage, her family, and the town that would never again see her as simply the sheriff's daughter. Night fell over the town, and with it came the uneasy quiet of a community wrestling with its soul. The saloon lamps flickered, the church bell stood silent, and the streets bore the scars of the day's battle: shattered glass, blood-stained dirt, and echoes of voices that refused to fade. The blind pianist sat at his familiar piano inside the dim saloon, his fingers moving across the keys. The notes were soft, sorrowful, but threaded with something more enduring: hope. The sheriff's daughter sat beside him, her hand resting on the polished wood as if drawing strength from both the music and the man who played it. For years, she had hidden her truth in silence, but tonight the whole town knew it. And instead of crumbling under the weight of exposure, she felt lighter. Her secret was no longer hers to bear alone. Yet freedom came with a cost. The eyes of the West would forever be upon her, measuring her worth, her choices, her strength. Her father entered the saloon, the lines on his face deeper than ever before. The townsfolk parted for him, no longer just out of respect for the sheriff, but for the man who had chosen redemption over pride. He looked at his daughter and her husband, and for once, there was no distance in his gaze. He had seen courage that humbled him, and he could no longer deny that she had become something greater than his protection. She had become his equal. The pianist's song filled the silence, carrying into the night air where the stars listened in stillness. The melody was not just for the dead outlaw, nor for the living townsfolk. It was for the desert itself, for the Old West that swallowed secrets and spit out legends. Every note seemed to stitch together what the bullets had torn apart, reminding them all that even in violence, love could carve out a place to endure. But beyond the music, beyond the lamplight, the vast plains stretched into darkness. And in that darkness lay more men, more secrets, and more battles waiting to unfold. From the West, peace was never permanent, only borrowed. And though the sheriff's daughter and her blind husband had survived this night, the story of their love and their courage was only just beginning to echo across the endless horizon. In the end, the story of the blind pianist and the sheriff's daughter was never just about a wedding or a secret revealed. It was about the weight of silence, the courage to face judgment, and the way love can transform even the harshest deserts into places of redemption. Their union did not erase the scars of the past, but it proved that even in the Old West, a land carved by violence and shadowed by fear, truth could still be stronger than vengeance. The daughter's secret, once a burden she thought would shatter her life, became the very spark that awakened a town too long ruled by silence. Her courage, paired with the steadfast strength of a husband who saw with his heart rather than his eyes, revealed that true bravery lies not in perfection, but in vulnerability. The sheriff, too, found his redemption not in the power of his badge, but in finally carrying the weight he should have borne long before. Together, their choices painted a lesson deeper than the dust of the streets or the echoes of gunfire. In every life, there are secrets, regrets, and moments that threaten to define us. Yet, like the pianist who transformed sound into vision, and the daughter who transformed shame into defiance, we are reminded that what once seemed a curse can become the very foundation of strength. The West may have been a place of lawless men, but it was also a stage where love and sacrifice forged legends. And so, as the pianist's song carried through the night, the town understood something vital. That heroes are not those who stand without flaw, but those who rise despite it. Their story lingers like a hymn across the plains, a reminder that even in darkness, there is always a note of hope waiting to be played, a truth waiting to be spoken, and a bond waiting to defy the silence of fear. If this tale moved you, let its echo continue. Share your voice in the comments, reflect on the courage that still speaks through this story, and join us by subscribing to the channel. Every like, every thought, and every word you share helps keep these legends alive, ensuring that the stories of love, sacrifice, and redemption from the Old West never fade into silence.